Hi guys, my name is Sia Ingers, and today I will be talking about this lovely book right here. It's written by Catherine Boo, and it is called Behind the Beautiful Forevers. It is around 254 pages and is about the undercity of Mumbai, as Boo calls it, but this is also known as the slums of India, which is how I've heard it been referred to as. This was my first time reading this book for MND 305, and I am very glad I took this opportunity to read nonfiction work like this. It's not my first pick, and I'm really glad that I like branched out and started to read work like this. As a reporter, I think this is a really important book to read. Three different lessons that I learned from it specifically was in the author's note on reporting. She pretty much like at the end talks about her experience writing this book as a journalist, which I'm not sure if that's normal for nonfiction work or not, but I really appreciated that, especially for this assignment, but also with the intention of trying to learn more from this book. And three things that I picked up was how this author is usually writing about poorer places in America and to apply that impoverished like reporting experience to an abroad like new culture. The second one was how she tried and avoided to like not make a personal connection with the subjects that she was talking to, but it obviously something that she found really difficult because she wrote a whole book about them and she got to know about such deep parts of their lives. And then number three, about how she tried to not overinterpret what was being said to her. So, going through these three things, I think they're really important for any journalist, but specifically to me because my beat is dealing with like policy affecting women and children. And a lot of what is going to fall under the scope of my beat is going to be about very sensitive topics and potentially also applying things that I have reported on in the past to a much more like personal level, depending on what stories I write. But starting with number one, which was applying reporting to impoverished places in America, how she like was able to do this abroad. I think this will be really beneficial to me because, for example, with my first news story, I have never reported on like school policy, but I have written stories about school as a student journalist, and I've also written stories about policy. So taking those two different areas and mashing them together and kind of, I guess, as a reporter, taking experiences and finding those similarities in new fields of reporting, I think that's a skill that everybody could learn. Number two, personal connection to the subject. This is always something that I struggle with a lot as a reporter. I pride myself on getting to know the people that I interview very well, especially when it's sort of a profile type of reporting story or like a profile story. And sometimes it is hard as a reporter to make sure that you're not getting too it's like too personal with your subjects to make sure that that objective side stays. But I like how she talks about how this is an issue and how she like navigates through it. I think what she said is that at the end of the day, like telling their stories in the most objective way possible is more beneficial to them than like being like opinionated. And so that's definitely a lesson that I learned, and I plan to apply that by making sure that when I'm talking to people, I apply that same mindset. And then number three, she said that she tried not to overinterpret what was being told to her. And although I think she might have fallen a little bit short on that, which I'll talk about in a second, I think that's also something that's really important. Like, instead of just assuming what your subject is trying to say to you, it's just better to ask a follow-up question. And I think the way I would apply that to my beat specifically right now, or just in general, is that I'm going to be dealing with a lot of sensitive topics, especially if I do cover reproductive health care or policy surrounding that. And right now I'm covering immigration, which is obviously a sensitive topic. So I want to make sure that just because I feel a certain way about that, that is not I'm not putting that into my story. Rather, I'm asking questions that are bringing out the thoughts of my subject or the people that I'm interviewing. And then one lesson I learned from the beginning, middle, and the end, I would say is part one, she introduced her characters very well. And I think she spent a lot of time in part one talking about like building the foundation. Obviously, I'm not doing this type of long form reporting in any way or like long form journalism, but I do think that's like a really important thing. Like we should, if you are telling a story of somebody's, like you should feel connected to the characters to begin with. For part two, which, sorry, I forgot to mention, this book is split into three different parts, but part two is where the climax happens. So I like that structure of even in nonfiction, that this part is like specifically talking about the conflict and it's the climax of the story, which is Asha's rise to power, which I'll talk about that when I'm talking about the book's overall, like my thoughts about the book in general. And then part three, what I learned from that was how she tied in the larger concepts there. I really like how she brought in the politics of like child labor, child detention, criminal like policy, and just like covering civil rights movements as Asha, who's like I would say one of the main characters in this book and her rise to power and becoming like the first women or the first female slum owner is what the book terms it. And so I think even though these three are kind of aligned together, I think each thing that I learned was how to report on different parts of the story. So the first part being introduction, make sure your readers are connecting to your writing. Number two, the climax, make sure it's interesting, but obviously keep it objective. And then number three is bringing in those larger term pictures later on. And then general thoughts I had about the book were that I definitely think this was written from a Western eye. Obviously, Catherine Boo is not from India, and I think like I could really tell that, especially as someone that is South Asian and has ancestry in India. But I will say that a lot of the text translates really well. I can tell like which colloquial phrases was translated from Hindi into English. And as a native Hindi speaker, I was able to like pick up on, okay, well, this term was definitely translated, but she translated it very well, which I think is really important. And then I was a tad bit confused at points about the nonfiction aspect of the book because I she used like subjective adjectives at certain points like bad or good, and I don't know if she was like phrasing or quoting, but that wasn't made very clear to me as a reader, and I just wish that those type of wording was not used, that type of wording was not used. And I think that honestly, as someone that's trying to read this book to learn, I just know to steer away from those things because I think the good or bad can be conveyed, but you don't actually have to say it. And then I also particularly enjoyed the discussion of different politics, considering like North versus South Indian politics, like related to migrants, Muslim Hindu politics, like post-colonialist politics, and I think that I really enjoyed the way that Boo embeds history into her reporting, but still makes us feel connected to her characters. Some of my favorite characters were Asha, Sunil, Rahul, Manju, who's Asha's daughter, and their entire families also, but those were just a few that stood out to me. And she like doesn't tell me to feel this way to them. She doesn't tell me to feel connected to them. Yet as a reader, I still do. And I will highlight my favorite character, who's Manju, and she had a certain desire to be like closer to Westerners. And I think that Boo does a great job at like explaining this through the lens of Manju, which I'm not sure if that's the best tactic for nonfiction writing because you are kind of falling into that overinterpreting category. But I definitely think that her entire writing of that character was portrayed in a way that Manju was trying to stay closer to Westerners because for context, Manju was the only one who had gotten to receive a college education, and that was because Asha, who's her mom, who the story follows her rise to power, she had forced her to go into that. And then to include a direct quote, I will say that this quote was from Sunil, who said, "Once my mother was beating me, and the thought came to me. I said, if what is happening now, you beating me, is to keep happening for the rest of my life, it would be a bad life, but it would be a life too." And I think this quote is the quote I chose because I think it essentially sums up all the different characters' thoughts of living in the slums of India, or how I like how Boo phrases it, which is the undercity, being surrounded by wealth and living in an impoverished area, yet still trying to seek the most out of life, which is genuinely the thought of every single one of these characters. I think this is a book that every journalist should read because of the stories, the way I learned about how to report stories and how Catherine Busso like beautifully makes us able to connect to the characters as if this was a fiction piece, but is still reporting. She's still reporting on what life is like in the slums, and she takes a very sociological approach to it, which I really love. And I think another reason would definitely be just to like learn more about reporting outside of your culture or reporting not even necessarily like abroad, but just outside of your like normal horizons. As reporters, we're always going to be exposed to different communities that we don't belong to different like places we don't belong to different like social classes that we belong to. And I think it's so important to be able to not be from that community and still be able to tell the stories properly. Overall, I give this story 8 oranges. I like the content, but I was a little bit confused sometimes on nonfiction and that overinterpretation part, because sometimes it sounded a little bit like too much like a story. But I also think that that's the beauty of Catherine Boo's reporting. And that's all for me today. Bye.